病痛，流离失所，失去了挚爱，也被世人不解和冷落。我不要在名利的光环下迷失自我，不忘初心，一往无前，点燃燎原之火，
让信仰引领不安的心。
这和马克思
为民营团结起来革命，
这和马克思
没有谁能熄灭我的热情，
这和马克思
为人类的解放守护真心，
这也和马克思。
尽管此刻我不被理解，你不懂我热爱的一切。或许我们要就此告别，我期待重逢的那一天。
我听说了，有人说我是阴谋家，说我是阴谋家，但是我没有分裂我们的协会吧？
马克思，你犯不着指桑骂槐。马克思，我知道你说的是我对你并没有什么不敬，只是我始终认为，只有当个人得到绝对自由时，人性才能获得最完满的实现。要通过暴动立即消灭国家，实现所有个人和团体的绝对自由。而你马克思主张要夺取政权，就是要把我们工人阶级带入没有自由的地狱中去。
巴库宁，你这种主张绝对自由的无政府主义，对我们的事业是极其危险和有害的。你口口声声说要绝对自由，要搞无政府主义，可是你不是也把克鲁泡特金、沃尔夫、加西亚、罗梅罗这些人组织成小团体了吗？
说得好，
说得好。
对。 Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Hope you liked that fucking hilarious intro. We are the Red Army. I'm Sal.
And I am Cokes. Alright. So we are taking a bit of a different route today, where the last time that we presented a heavy theory, it was more philosophical. We're kind of going in a more direction of political economy this time. And it's very important because we have to understand the organs of capital and how they operate in order to understand their contradictions. And starting in political economy, I think, is very important. And I hope this will be very instructional and helpful for those who are more so beginners in this. So, this is a piece from Marx that I think is very important and should precede reading any heavy political economy or theory on political economy like Capital. Capital it's not really dense, but it's very long, and so it's kind of like running a marathon. And I think this piece, Wage, Labor, and Capital, it's kind of like starting off with a jog. And it's nice because it's a lot more concrete, and Marx gets straight to the point, and you can cover a lot in just 50 pages. So that's what we're going to be going over today. Okay. So we're just going to jump right into it. All right, so Marx breaks this down into a bunch of sections. And the first section is titled, What are wages? How are they determined? Because one of the bases of capitalism is wage labor, a very unique type of labor, and it's unique to capitalism, so Marx analyzed it. And so he analyzed first, again, this concept of wages. So he says that wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work. So, and it's paid on credit. And what this means is you perform your work first and you get paid later. So, you don't get paid right as you're doing your labor, right? So you're kind of counting on the capitalist to pay you that wage to survive. So Marx makes a very important distinction, and that is that we're not selling our labor to the capitalist, but we're selling our labor power. And this is the commodity which the capitalist is paying us for in the form of a wage. And I already described what a wage is. And so this is essentially the form of payment that is being expressed in the market. So Marx says the wage expresses, quote, the relation in which labor power is exchanged for other commodities, the exchange value of labor power. So essentially wages are the price of the labor power commodity, right? Where everything else has a price on the market, an exchange value, so too does the labor power. I'm going to quote Marx again. He says, wages, therefore, are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by himself. Wages are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. So productive labor power is just the commodity of labor power that is able to be put into sort of what we call dead labor, which is embodied in a commodity. So we change it through working, and we give it a higher value. So, and this also leads to this concept of alienation. Essentially, the laborer works not for the purpose of producing the product, but to secure a wage to survive. This is why we enter into the market to sell our labor power. It changes completely the social relations that are at work. And we also have to remember that economic modes of production are heavily relying on these social relations, and this is how we should analyze them largely. And this is one of those things where we work to secure a wage, and this ultimately changes the actual character of labor. So it alienates us from the actual labor process. And I'm going to quote Marx again here, straight from the text. He says, labor power was not always a commodity, merchandise. Labor was not always wage labor, i.e. free labor. The slave did not sell his labor power to the slave owner any more than the ox sells his labor to the farmer. The slave, together with his labor power, was sold to his owner once and for all. He is a commodity that can pass from the hand of one owner to that of another. He himself is a commodity, but his labor power is not his commodity. The serf sells only a portion of his labor power. It is not he who receives wages from the owner of the land. It is rather the owner of the land who receives a tribute from him. The serf belongs to the soil, and to the lord of the soil he brings its fruit. The free laborer, on the other hand, sells his very self, and that by fractions.
He auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, one day like the next, to the highest bidder, to the owner of raw materials, tools, and the means of life, i.e., to the capitalist. The laborer belongs neither to an owner nor to the soil, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his daily life belong to whomsoever buys them. The worker leaves the capitalist, to whom he has sold himself, as often as he chooses, and the capitalist discharges him as often as he sees fit, as soon as he no longer gets any use, or not the required use, out of him. But the worker, whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power, cannot leave the whole class of buyers, i.e., the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class. And it is for him to find this man, i.e., to find a buyer in this capitalist class. So, again, this is emphasizing this whole point of labor power becoming a commodity, and the whole point of this section is to sum up that wages are the exchange value, essentially, of labor power. It's what the capitalist pays us for this commodity. Okay, so then Marx moves on to this next section, where he says, the question being, by what is the price of a commodity determined? So now he's kind of going backwards, panning out and discussing commodities in general. So there's a few criteria. The first one is the competition between buyers and sellers. So essentially, sellers aim to dominate the market, and so they compete to sell cheaper than the rest of the sellers to attract buyers. But buyers compete to purchase, and what this causes is a driving up of the prices of commodities. And while they compete amongst each other, they also compete against each other. So buyers and sellers compete not only in their own arenas, but in each other's as well. So, quote, the army among whose troops there is less fighting carries off the victory over the opposing host. That's the first criteria, is this competition in buyers and sellers and between the two. The next criteria is the relation of demand to supply. So, when supply is lower than demand, there is competition among sellers equaling none. We find that because there is such a low supply but such a high demand, there's no competition among sellers because they're all easily able to sell because there's such high demand. So competition among buyers is now extreme, which drives prices up. And the thing with capitalism is that the opposite case is more common. The crises of capitalism are of overabundance. They're the manifestation of this grand contradiction between the relations of production and the productive forces. To put it simply, essentially, capitalists need you to buy. But without giving you a wage enough to buy, no one becomes able to purchase. And so we are left with an excess. And this causes collapses every, 5 to 10 years, as Marx would have predicted. Quote, if the price of a commodity rises considerably owing to a failing supply or a disproportionately growing demand, then the price of some other commodity must have fallen in proportion. For of course the price of a commodity only expresses in money the proportion in which other commodities will be given in exchange for it. So, if a commodity's price increases, what happens is capital is thrown into this industry to revive it, and what will happen is this will continue until the commodity's price dips, and it dips below the cost of production. And this converse can happen as well. So, quote, we see how capital continually emigrates out of the province of one industry and immigrates into that of another. The high price produces an excess immigration, and a low price an excess emigration. So if a price is really high, no one can buy it because there's such a low supply. And so what happens is capital is invested heavily into this industry to drive its price down. And once this happens, it sort of settles out. And the reciprocal process naturally regulates the price of commodities, where it happens one after the other. And so there are natural laws of price, of wages, of all pricing of commodities that are at play, where you can force it in one direction, but you will realize that no one, for example, will be able to buy your products, and so you have to go in the reverse. And what happens is this fluctuation, it doesn't affect it, or it doesn't serve like an individual manufacturer, but it affects manufacturers as a whole entire class. So, and owing to all this, we now say that the prices of wages, since they are the exchange value of a commodity, they're determined in the same way of this entire process that I just explained, where because labor power is the commodity in this case that we're discussing, and wages are the price. So now he goes on to his next section, by what are wages determined? So wages, as they are the price of the commodity of labor power, they fluctuate, just as the prices of other commodities, as I explained above. So the cost of production of labor power, quote, it is the cost required for the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer and for his education and training as a laborer. So the cost of labor power is paying for keeping you alive. So we're keeping you alive and giving you an education to be trained in whatever skill you are providing for the capitalist. So there's this argument that capitalism required mass education of the peasants in this transition from feudalism, precisely because we had more refine's a bad word, maybe more particular types of labor, where it wasn't just working physically on fields, it now turned to more acute methods of labor. And this isn't necessarily owing to capitalism, it's just a natural historical progression, inevitable in the case of capitalism, where they needed to do this. So, just as the prices of commodities account for machine wear, the price of labor power must account for the laborer's ability to multiply, produce new wage laborers. So there's always a cost for a capitalist when purchasing raw materials or a means of production of machine. And it accounts for the fact that the machine is going to wear over time. And so when they price their commodities, for example, they put into this this pricing the amount that they're accounting for over this, let's say, a 10-year period. And the same thing goes for labor power, where the wages have to include this amount of taking into account that you are going to raise a family. It's not out of the benevolence of the capitalist class, of course. It is out of the necessity of producing new wage laborers. They need procreation to actually continue having labor power as a commodity that they can purchase. Moving on, we now go to the section, the nature and growth of capital. So, Marx says that a person is only a slave under very specific conditions. Similarly, an instrument of production is capital under very specific conditions. So things can be capital in one instance and they cannot be capital in other instances at all, owing to what is happening, essentially, right? So in production, humans work on nature and each other. So this is something that Marx said, where working together to produce, we enter into connections and relations to one another. And hence, this is how production takes place. And this is the social character of production under capitalism. So these relations change according to the character of the means of production. So now I'm going to reference a quote that says, we thus see that the social relations within which individuals produce, the social relations of production, are altered, transformed with the change and development of the material means of production, of the forces of production. The relations of production in their totality constitute what is called the social relations, society, and moreover, a society at a definite stage of historical development, a society with peculiar, distinctive characteristics. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois or capitalist society are such totalities of relations of production, each of which denotes a particular stage of development in the history of mankind. Capital also is a social relation of production. It is a bourgeois relation of production, a relation of production of bourgeois society. The means of subsistence, the instruments of labor, the raw materials of which capital consists, have they not been produced and accumulated under given social conditions within definite special relations? Are they not employed for new production under given special conditions within definite social relations? And does not just this same definite social character stamp the products which serve for new production as capital? So capital relies, or something is considered capital depending on what it's being used for. And this is the social relation. So capital also consists of exchange values. So all products of which it consists are commodities. So, quote, capital, consequently, is not only a sum of material products. It is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. Capital remains the same, whether we put cotton in the place of wool, rice in the place of wheat, steamships in the place of railroads, provided only that the cotton, the rice, the steamships, the body of capital, have the same exchange value, the same price as the wool, the wheat, the railroads, in which it was previously embodied. The bodily form of capital may transform itself continually, while capital does not suffer the least alteration. So the manifestations of capital, these exchange values, we know they're exchangeable because they can have, for example, the same market price, right? So they are directly exchangeable, and these are the bodily forms of capital transforming themselves, while capital itself is not actually altering; it's just changing forms. However, the converse is not necessarily true. So not every sum of commodities of exchange values is capital. So the sum of exchange values becoming capital in preserving itself and multiplying by exchange with direct living labor power. That's how it becomes capital. It must actually preserve itself, and it has to valorize or give itself or increase its value, multiply by exchange with direct living labor power. So living labor is us. It's the people who are actually working, right? But dead labor is expressed in whatever is handed to us to labor with. The raw materials, which are considered, I guess, not to have dead labor if they come straight from the earth. But the mining process is this dead labor. So, for example, if we are using steel, raw steel, it is forged. And so its value is embodies dead labor. And we're impacting it with living labor to increase its value. In this case, it would be capital. Quote, the existence of a class which possesses nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. This is where surplus value comes from. It comes from this living labor putting more value into whatever the raw materials are that they came in from. And so when the capitalist sells them for a profit, the wages are accounted for such that they make that profit, and this is where that surplus value comes from. This is where that expropriation is. So, quote, capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor as a means for new production. It consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as the means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. So, these products that come in have accumulated labor in them, and this is their value. Right? Because, this is what Marx says, is that the value of something is the amount of labor that's put into it. So this accumulated labor in raw material comes in, let's say mined ore. We receive ore to transform it to something else. It already has accumulated labor in it. This labor of mining. And we add on to it with living labor. Moving on, we go to the next section. Relation of wage labor to capital. So, again, laborers sell their labor power on the market to the highest bidding capitalist, who pays the laborer a wage, which is a portion of the existing means of subsistence. So the wages not only replace what the worker consumes, their labor power, which is used to add further value to the accumulated labor in the existing commodities to give them greater value, right? But a laborer does not only produce commodities, they produce capital. So, quote, he produces values which serve anew to command his work and to create by means of it new values. So, I'll reference another quote here, which says, capital can multiply itself only by exchanging itself for labor power, by calling wage labor into life. The labor power of the wage labor can exchange itself for capital only by increasing capital, by strengthening that very power whose slave it is. Increase of capital, therefore, is increase of the proletariat, i.e. of the working class. So this is that dialectical relationship between wage labor and capital, where they are in contradiction to one another, but they also rely on each other. They build and strengthen each other, right? So, quote, the fastest possible growth of productive capital is, therefore, the indispensable condition for a tolerable life to the laborer. And essentially, growth of productive capital is the growth of the power of accumulated labor over living labor, of the rule of the bourgeoisie over the working class. So in producing more capital, the working class also maintains the process whereby the means of subsistence flow back to it. So I'm going to quote Marx again. As long as the wage laborer remains a wage laborer, his lot is dependent upon capital. That is what the boasted community of interests between worker and capitalists amount to. If capital grows, the mass of wage labor grows. The number of wage workers increases. In a word, the sway of capital extends over a great mass of individuals. Let us suppose the most favorable case. If productive capital grows, the demand for labor grows. It therefore increases the price of labor power, wages. So, a rise in a wage, as I just said, requires first a growth of productive capital, whose growth calls also a growth of wealth, luxury, social needs, and pleasures. And I'm going to quote Marx again, because he puts it best. He says, therefore, although the pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker in comparison with the stage of development of society in general. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society. We therefore measure them in relation to society. We do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratification. Since they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. And so again, society, as capital accumulates and wages therefore relatively grow, society produces more luxuries and more needs, and this is how we view it in sort of a relative sense. So then the question is asked, are wages determined only by the money price? Well, in the 16th century, Marx says the values of gold and silver fell in relation to other commodities due to their great abundance. But wage laborers received the same wages in these metals. Therefore, their wages fell. Quote, this was one of the circumstances which furthered the growth of capital, the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 18th century. So a lot of where that wealth came from was the fact that a nominal wage did not change, even though since they were using metals, gold and silver, as their money, the fact that their abundance grew drove their value down. So the nominal value stayed the same, but relative to the fact that there is a great abundance, they actually fell in real value. So Marx references a specific event, how in the winter of 1847, the prices of essential means of subsistence, grains, meat, butter, cheese, etc., rose in price, but wages did not change. So wages fell. So one or the other goes up. Kind of the thing that bourgeois academia really pushes is this idea that wages are sort of the end-all, be-all of wealth, where they don't realize that our wage affords us commodities, essentially. And the commodities and our labor power, since it's a commodity, we are comparing it, our wage that we're being paid for, to other commodities directly. So this is the whole the flowing and ebbing of social relations that are sort of beneath the surface, that if we don't observe them, we sort of they go over our head, and they shouldn't go over our head because it's very important. So again, Marx says here, your wage might stay the same, but if the market of commodities that are necessary or not necessary, but in general necessary, let's say, they rise in price, well, your wage fell, even though nominally it didn't. But again, bourgeois academia pushes this idea that our wage, the number on the paper, is what matters. But again, because there's this relation of commodities to money to commodities, if one changes, it affects the other one, even though nominally it doesn't change. So again, nominal wage here is the money price of labor power. And this does not coincide with real wages. So real wage is the amount of commodities a laborer can buy for money, right? It's in relation to other commodities. It's always about this relation. If that ratio changes, let's say it's a 1-to-1, you get paid just enough to buy everything of the means of subsistence. This is your wage. If the means of subsistence increase in value, your wage has gone down. If they decrease in value, your wage has gone up, even though nominally it doesn't change. Again, I'm going to quote Marx again. He says, but neither the nominal wages, i.e. the amount of money for which the laborer sells himself to the capitalist, nor the real wages, i.e. the amount of commodities which he can buy for this money, exhausts the relations which are comprehended in the term wages. Wages are determined above all by their relations to the gain, the profit of the capitalist. In other words, wages are a proportionate relative quantity. Real wages express the price of labor power in relation to the price of commodities. Relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of immediate labor in the value newly created by it, in relation to the share of it which falls to accumulated labor, to capital. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to move on to the next section here. This next section is titled The General Law That Determines the Rise and Fall of Wages and Profits. So, another quick quote from Marx. He's got great quotes, that's all I'm going to say. He says, "We have said, wages are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by him. Wages are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. But the capitalist must replace these wages out of the price for which he sells the product made by the worker. He must so replace it that, as a rule, there remains to him a surplus above the cost of production expended by him. That is, he must get a profit." And so again, capitalists, they need to make profit, otherwise their existence is not justified. This is how their existence is perpetuated, by actually accumulating more and more capital. This is the whole point of capitalism, is the continuous growth and the movement of capital. So essentially the selling price of commodities produced by the worker is divided, in the point of view from the capitalist, into three parts. So the first one is replacement of price of raw materials advanced by him, in addition to replacement of wear and tear of tools, machines, and other instruments of labor, likewise advanced by him. So you want to replace existing values. This is kind of the first thing. The second thing is the replacement of wages advanced. So you have to taking out of the new value, it's produced by the labor, and it's added to the raw materials. Then there's the surplus, the leftover, the profit. This is taken out of the new value, and it's produced by the labor and added to the raw materials. So wages and profit are viewed as shares in the product of the worker, essentially, right? This is why they say profit is theft. You're getting your wage, but the rest of it is still there, and it's going to the capitalist, even though it all goes to the labor that produced it, or should. So again, real wages can stay the same while relative wages fall. He goes back to this. I'm going to quote him again. He says, "Real wages may remain the same. They may even rise. Nevertheless, the relative wages may fall. Let us suppose, for instance, that all means of subsistence have fallen 2/3 in price, while the day's wage have fallen but 1/3, for example, from 3 to 2 shillings. Although the worker can now get a greater amount of commodity with these 2 shillings that he formerly did with 3 shillings, his wages have decreased in proportion to the gain of the capitalist. The profit of the capitalist, the manufacturers, for instance, has increased 1 shilling, which means that for a smaller amount of exchange values, which he pays to the worker, the latter must produce a greater amount of exchange values than before. The share of capital in proportion to the share of labor has risen. The distribution of social wealth between capital and labor has become still more unequal. The capitalist commands a greater amount of labor with the same capital. The power of the capitalist class over the working class has grown. The social position of the worker has become worse, has been forced down still another degree below that of the capitalist." So, the general law that determines the rise or fall of wages and profits is in a reciprocal relation. So, quote, "They stand in inverse proportion to each other. The share of capital, profit, increases in the same proportion in which the share of labor, wages, falls, and vice versa. Profit rises in the same degree in which wages fall. It falls in the same degree in which wages rise." End quote. So then Marx proposes a potential argument, which he refutes. And the argument is that a capitalist can take advantage of other capitalists, independently of rise and fall of wages, or improve the instruments of labor, the new applications of forces of nature, etc., to make greater profits. So the argument is, why can't capitalists just bypass these sort of social laws that sort of govern the relation between wages and capital? Well, the first refutation is that the results are going to stay the same, but they're going to arise in an opposite manner. So, quote from Marx, he says, "Profit indeed has not risen because wages have fallen, but wages have fallen because profit has risen. With the same amount of another man's labor, the capitalist has bought a larger amount of exchange values without having paid more for the labor on that account, i.e., the work is paid for less in proportion to the net gain which it yields to the capitalist. So they have to find a balance, how much they pay you and how much they can take, because how much they pay you can determine how much of the actual exchange values they're going to reap and how much profit they're actually going to make. So the second refutation is, despite fluctuation in prices of commodities, the average prices of these commodities is determined by the cost of production, as I earlier mentioned. So, quote, the acts of overreaching and taking advantage of one another within the capitalist ranks necessarily equalizes them, because it's not one capitalist, right? It's a class of capitalists. And when you have a class of capitalists, we know that the actions of one impact the others. And when they're all impacting each other over a general period of time, they equalize themselves out, the prices that they are selling at, and therefore the wages. So, a quote from Marx again. The improvements of machinery, the new applications of the forces of nature in the service of production, make it possible to produce in a given period of time, with the same amount of labor and capital, a larger amount of products, but in no wise a larger amount of exchange value. If by the use of the spinning machine I can furnish twice as much yarn in an hour as before its invention, for instance 100 pounds instead of 50 pounds, in the long run I receive back, in exchange for this 100 pounds, no more commodities than I did before for 50, because the cost of production has fallen by 1/2, or because I can furnish double the product at the same cost. So there's kind of an inverse relation here, where it's not just that producing more means it's going to sell more, right? And so these are pulling at each other, and over the long run, you can't just bypass it by saying I'm going to do this independently of wage cost, right? So the third refutation is essentially, in whatever proportion net revenue is distributed among the capitalists, the total net revenue always consists, quote, of the amount by which accumulated labor has been increased from the proceeds of direct labor. This whole amount, therefore, grows in the same proportion in which labor augments capital, i.e., in the same proportion in which profit rises as compared with wages. So, because wages and profits are linked, immediately bypassing this rise and fall of wages to take advantage of other capitalists, improve instruments of labor to just make more money, it doesn't work as a general rule of thumb, because it's being pulled back by this other social cost, which is the wage. And so now he goes into the next section, which is talking about the interests of each. So it's titled, The Interests of Capital and Wage Labor Are Diametrically Opposed. The Effect of Growth of Productive Capital on Wages. Kind of a long header, but, you know. Marx says, the growth of capital is synonymous with the decrease in relative wages. So even though real wages rise with nominal wages, the growth of capital necessarily dictates that these rises are going to be at a lower rate than the rise of capital accumulation. So, quote, if, for instance, in good business years, wages rise 5% while profits rise 30%, the relative wage, has not increased but decreased. And this is going back to that point that I mentioned earlier, where if they're not moving proportionally, one of them is going down and the other one's increasing in value. Right? So in capitalist relations, the more capital grows, the more dependent labor actually becomes on capital. So in capitalist relations, workers need capital to grow because it means the increase in the number of what Marx says, crumbs, which fall to them. So, however, this reliance doesn't change the fact that the actual interests of the worker and the capitalist are completely opposed. So, essentially, this idea of an economic struggle doesn't, and this goes back to our typical theory that we study, which says that, you can't have simply an economic struggle because changing numbers on the page doesn't actually change the political antagonisms of class struggle, right? The interests of the worker and the capitalist, no matter how many crumbs are falling to the worker or how little profits the capitalists are making, remain opposed. They're completely in opposition. This is why there's always that tension, this class struggle, this irreconcilable antagonism. So the antagonisms of class remain. And Marx says, quote, profits and wages remain as before in inverse proportion. And it's because they're in this inverse proportion that interests are opposed, right? what do we seek to do by working? We seek to survive. We seek to get a wage, to have a means of subsistence, and this is our wage. And on the opposite pole, we have profit, which is of the interest of the capitalist, and it's not to survive necessarily day to day. They have that survival. Their interest is to accumulate capital because it really just it augments this class struggle and gives them more control. So those interests are completely diametrically opposed, right? And so Marx asks the question, in what manner does the growth of productive capital affect wages? Well, as productive capital grows, quote, there takes place a more many-sided accumulation of labor. Marx talks about this in other texts where the accumulation of wealth at one pole means the accumulation of misery and toiling at the other. And this is that dialectical relationship where at one pole you have an increase in the wealth of this class, you have an increase in the misery or the destitution of this other class. And this is that relationship. So the number of capitalists will increase far, far, far less so than workers, of course. And to outdo competitors, individual capitalists start to realize that they have to sell as cheaply as possible. And this means they have to increase the productive forces of labor as much as they possibly can. So what does this mean? Well, an increase in the productive forces is typically most easily achieved by a greater division of labor. So capitalists are now actually competing to better divide labor, get better machinery, and therefore exploit more. So an interesting point here is this division of labor. And it comes back to this materialist progression of history, where we kind of, in our vulgar analysis, we would say that division of labor led to capitalism. But it's actually it's in reverse. The conditions of capitalism and the way the capitalist class makes profit necessitated that they divide labor. So the order of occurrence is important here. It wasn't that feudal labor was divided and suddenly they realized and capitalism came into being. No, of course, the capitalist relations were imposed through years of primitive accumulation and violence. And one of the things that came out of that was the realization that the division of labor will yield much higher profits. So, going back here, the capitalist has now attained better productive forces. And so now they can produce a greater amount in a shorter period of time, better than their competition. So they're going to sell their commodities at lower prices. Quote Marx again here. He says, quote, but the capitalist will not sell the whole yard so cheaply as his competitors sell the half yard, although the production of the whole yard costs him no more than does that of the half yard to the others. However, otherwise, he would make no extra profit and would get back in exchange only the cost of production. He might obtain a greater income from having set in motion a larger capital, but not from having made a greater profit on his capital than the others. Moreover, he attains the object he is aiming at if he prices his goods only a small percentage lower than his competitors. He drives them off the field. He wrests from them at least part of their market by underselling them. So, they're not going to sell them at half the price. They're not going to sell them at radically lower. They're just going to sell them at just enough where it will draw the buyers. And this is how they drive other capitalists out. And again, this process of accumulation, if we want to put the pieces of the puzzle together, it inevitably leads to this point of where you have monopoly capitalism. And what is monopoly capitalism? Imperialism. So this whole entire process is necessary because it drives capitalists in extreme competition with each other. And this is what leads us to this phase of imperialism. Okay. Take a brief breather here. Yeah, we're definitely going to have a discussion of this. That's a good point, Joyce. This is pretty dense. And it's so dense that I am now realizing that I didn't do the last section. And this is a good time, I think. If you have the text, I don't know if you have it at home, or you can just pull it up on Marxist.com. It's fairly short, and it's actually pretty important. It's the effect of capitalist competition on the capitalist, the middle class, and the working class. So it talks about these social relations that are essential. And so actually we're going to go through that. I feel like I understand, but I know. Yeah, it is quite intense. I will not, I mean, rereading is going to be really useful here. But also, I do recommend, I think a lot of times we say that Capital is a very dense text, which I don't agree with. I don't think it's dense. It's long. Um, but you can get through it. And I'm still getting through it myself. But this is kind of like a really good primer. And there's the other text that it kind of usually goes with, which is Wages, Price, and Profit, or Value, Price, and Profit is another title for it. It has both. I don't know which one's correct, but I think they're both correct. Isn't the first? Yes. That's a good point. It's really just the first, like I'd say, I don't know, 1 to 3rd chapter of Capital, I would say. But actually more so the first. First one kind of sets the ground for a lot of equations and relations that you kind of want to get down. But once you have them down and listening to explanations of this, and I think at some point I'll actually, I don't know if we're going to post in the chat, it'd be kind of useful. Resources. Obviously, David Harvey going over Capital is pretty cool, in my opinion. It's really useful. He explains it pretty well, and he's actually pretty principled, so it's good to see. Okay. All right, we're going to go through the last section. Last section is fairly short, and so it's about 4 pages, so we're going to just read through it. And I don't know, LibreVox audiobook. Yeah, it is very mathy, but once you have it down, it will make a lot more sense. This is a good primer. This kind of goes over these relations. Once you have those relations down, it's a lot easier to understand this dynamic. But again, this is like I said, this is the jog before you do the marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not like a sprint for whatever it is, 800 pages, I guess. It's a long, you got to pace yourself, but it's not dense. But anyways, we're going to read through this last section. Effect of capitalist competition on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class. We thus see how the method of production and the means of production are constantly enlarged, revolutionized, how division of labor necessarily draws after it greater division of labor, the employment of machinery, greater employment of machinery, work upon a large scale, work upon a still greater scale. This is the law that continually throws capitalist production out of its old ruts and compels capital to strain ever more the productive forces of labor, for the very reason that it has already strained them. The law that grants it no respite and constantly shouts in its ear, "March, march." This is no other law than that which, within the periodical fluctuations of commerce, necessarily adjusts the price of a commodity to its cost of production. So again, these social laws, even though there's fluctuations immediately, it will always, over the aggregate, drive it down to its cost of production. And so it's always subject to that. No matter how powerful the means of production which a capitalist may bring into the field, competition will make their adoption general. And from the moment they have been generally adopted, the sole result of the greater productiveness of his capital will be that he must furnish at the same price, 10, 20, 100 times as much as before. But since he must find a market for perhaps 1,000 times as much in order to outweigh the lower selling price by the greater quantity of the sale, since now a more extensive sale is necessary not only to gain a greater profit, but also in order to replace the cost of production, the instrument of production itself grows always more costly, as we have seen. And since this more extensive sale has become a question of life and death, not only for him, but also for his rivals, the old struggle must begin again, and it is all the more violent the more powerful the means of production already invented are. The division of labor and the application of machinery will therefore take a fresh start and upon an even greater scale. So it gets more and more antagonistic as time goes along, as the instruments of production become more refined. Whatever be the power of the means of production which are employed, competition seeks to rob capital of the golden fruits of this power by reducing the price of commodities to the cost of production, in the same measure in which production is cheapened, i.e. in the same measure in which more can be produced with the same amount of labor. It compels by a law which is irresistible a still greater cheapening of production, the sale of ever greater masses of product for smaller prices. Thus, the capitalist will have gained nothing more by his efforts than the obligation to furnish a greater product in the same labor time. In a word, more difficult conditions for the profitable employment of his capital. while competition, therefore, constantly pursues him with its law of the cost of production and turns against himself every weapon that he forges against his rivals. The capitalist continually seeks to get the best of his competition by restlessly introducing further subdivision of labor and new machines, which, though more expensive, enable him to produce more cheaply instead of waiting until the new machines shall have been rendered obsolete by competition. If we now conceive this feverish agitation as it operates in the market of the whole world, we shall be in a position to comprehend how the growth, accumulation, and concentration of capital bring in their train an ever more detailed subdivision of labor, an ever greater improvement of old machines, and a constant application of new machines, a process which goes on interruptedly with feverish haste and upon an ever more gigantic scale. But what effect do these conditions, which are inseparable from the growth of productive capital, have upon the determination of wages? The greater division of labor enables one laborer to accomplish the work of 5, 10, or 20 laborers. It therefore increases competition among the laborers fivefold, tenfold, or 20-fold. The laborers compete not only by selling themselves one cheaper than the other, but also by one doing the work of 5, 10, or 20. And they are forced to compete in this manner by the division of labor, which is introduced and steadily improved by capital. Furthermore, to the same degree in which the division of labor increases, is the labor simplified. The special skill of the laborer becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple, monotonous force of production, with neither physical nor mental elasticity. His work becomes accessible to all. Therefore, competitors press upon him from all sides. Moreover, it must be remembered that the more simple, the more easily learned the work is, so much less is its cost of production, the expense of its acquisition, and so much lower must the wages sink. For, like the price of any other commodity, they are determined by the cost of production. Therefore, in the same manner in which labor becomes more unsatisfactory, more repulsive, do competition increase and wages decrease. The laborer seeks to maintain the total of his wages for a given time by performing more labor, either by working a great number of hours, or by accomplishing more in the same number of hours. Thus, urged on by want, he himself multiplies the disastrous effects of division of labor. The result is, the more he works, the less wages he receives. And for this simple reason, the more he works, the more he competes against his fellow workmen, the more he compels them to compete against him, and to offer themselves in the same wretched conditions as he does, so that, in the last analysis, he competes against himself as a member of the working class. Machinery produces the same effects, but upon a much larger scale. It supplants skilled laborers by unskilled men, by women, adults by children, where newly introduced. It throws workers upon the streets in great masses, and as it becomes more highly developed and more productive, it discards them in additional, though smaller numbers. We have hastily sketched in broad outlines the industrial war of capitalists among themselves. This war has the peculiarity that the battles in it are won less by recruiting than by discharging the army of workers. The generals, the capitalists, vie with one another as to who can discharge the greatest number of industrial soldiers. The economists tell us, to be sure, that those laborers who have been rendered superfluous by machinery find new venues of employment. They dare not assert directly that the same laborers that have been discharged find situations in new branches of labor. Facts cry out too loudly against this lie. Strictly speaking, they only maintain that new means of employment will be found for other sections of the working class. For example, for that portion of the young generation of laborers who were about to enter upon that branch of industry which had just been abolished. Of course, this is a great satisfaction to the disabled laborers. There will be no lack of fresh exploitable blood and muscle for the Messrs. Capitalists. The dead may bury their dead. This consolation seems to be intended more for the comfort of the capitalists themselves than their laborers. If the whole class of the wage labor were to be annihilated by machinery, how terrible that would be for capital, which, without labor, ceases to be capital. We have an interesting point here that we're going to stop and talk about, and that is this idea of automation. So there's this idea of post-industrialism, where we're moving past this industrial phase in the United States and countries like it, and that all our jobs are going to be automated. But remember, we talked about this earlier in the text. Wage labor and capital are in a dialectical relationship. So our jobs may be automated, But not all jobs can be automated, because if all jobs are automated and wage labor disappears, profit disappears. Capital ceases to be capital, because without this contradiction of wage labor in relation to it, it isn't capital. It just stops being capital, and it makes the entire capitalist class obsolete. They have no purpose. They have no reason to exist at this point. And suddenly our social relations are going to have to change. They've entered into a new relation, no longer capitalist. So, and this is where we have to remember that no, we're not all going to be, all our jobs are going to be automated. In the age of imperialism, what happens? They are put overseas through the export of capital to more lower paying jobs overseas, right? So this argument that we're all going to be automated, I think defies a bit of this internationalism. It kind of breeds a sense of chauvinism, because it kind of makes us forget that in the age of imperialism and colonialism, what is happening here is all our jobs, the lowest paying jobs are leaving. And you may automate what you would call post-industrial nation, but the world can never be post-industrial. Wage labor will never disappear. Anyways, this is an interesting point that I want to bring up. We're going to move on here. But even if we assume that all who are directly forced out of employment by machinery, as well as all of the rising generation who are waiting for a chance of employment in the same branch of industry, do actually find some new employment, are we to believe that this new employment will pay as high wages as did the one they have lost? If it did, it would be in contradiction to the laws of political economy. We have seen how modern industry always tends to the substitutions of the simpler and more subordinate employments for the higher and more complex ones. How then could a mass of workers thrown out of one branch of industry by machinery find refuge in another branch unless they were to be paid more poorly? An exception to the law has been adduced, namely the workers who are employed in the manufacture of machinery itself. As soon as there is an industry, a greater demand for and a greater consumption of machinery, it is said that the number of machines must necessarily increase. Consequently, also the manufacture of machines. Consequently, also the employment of workers in machine manufacture. And the workers employed in this branch of industry are skilled, even educated workers. Since the year 1840, this assertion, which even before that date was only half true, has lost all semblance of truth, for the most diverse machines are now applied to the manufacture of the machines themselves on quite as extensive a scale as in the manufacture of cotton yarn, and the laborers employed in machine factories can but play the role of very stupid machines alongside of the highly ingenious machines. But in the place of the man who has been dismissed by the machine, the factory may employ, perhaps, 3 children and 1 woman. And must not the wages of the man have previously sufficed for the 3 children and 1 woman? Must not the minimum wages have sufficed for the preservation and propagation of the race? What then do these beloved bourgeois phrases prove? Nothing more than that now 4 times as many workers' lives are used up as there were previously in order to obtain the livelihood of 1 working family. To sum up, the more productive capital grows, the more it extends the division of labor and the application of machinery. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery extend, the more does competition extend among the workers, and more do their wages shrink together. In addition, the working class is also recruited from the higher strata of society. A mass of small businessmen and of people living upon the interest of their capital is precipitated into the ranks of the working class, and they will have nothing else to do than to stretch out their arms alongside of the arms of the workers. Thus, the forest of outstretched arms, begging for work, grows ever thicker, while the arms themselves grow ever leaner. It is evident that the small manufacturer cannot survive in a struggle in which the first condition of success is production upon an ever greater scale, i.e., to be a large and not a small manufacturer. It is evident that the interest on capital decreases in the same measure as the mass and number of capitals increases as capital grows. That therefore the man living on the interest from his pension becomes unable to do so, i.e., must throw himself to industry, i.e., to the rank of the small manufacturers, thereby increasing the number of candidates for the proletariat. All this requires no further elucidation. I'm going to pause here and bring up another point, and that is why Marx very specifically says that the proletariat is the most revolutionary class in a capitalist society. Other classes exist. To say that they are revolutionary would be wrong. And we're using a materialist analysis here. I think we're going to briefly touch on class here before I finish this up. I see a lot of, we see in general a lot of sort of miscommunication as to what we mean by class. So this small manufacturer that Marx mentions here, this would be like your petty bourgeois, or little bourgeoisie, or you would call them, perhaps national, but typically the small bourgeoisie. There's the big bourgeoisie, which in the age of imperialism you might have called the comprador bourgeoisie, but nonetheless. So we have the proletariat, which is the class that is forced to sell its labor power to the capitalists to survive. We then have the petty bourgeoisie. Petty bourgeoisie, we have to understand it as a class. I see a lot of confusion of this. The petty bourgeoisie is not exempt from revolutionary participation. What it is exempt from is revolutionary leadership. And because it inherently, in the immediate sense, possesses different interests than the proletariat. And what Marx says here is the small manufacturers, because of the nature of capitalism, cannot compete with the big bourgeoisie. So the proletariat is an ever-growing class. It's the most revolutionary because the proletariat comes from the lumpen proletariat, perhaps. It comes from the petty bourgeoisie. But the class that ever grows is the proletariat. And so this is why this class that sort of comes to this realization that it has no choice but to sell itself to the capitalists. And this is why it is the most revolutionary, is because it comes to this realization, and also through the social relations of labor, the way the laborers work together. And this is why capitalism kind of breeds the own conditions for its destruction, right? Yes, the lumps are a different group. The lumpen proletariat is, if we're going to use a sort of Fanon's description, they're not antithetical to revolution. They're absolutely necessary to revolution. But again, we come to this argument of who's supposed to lead the revolution, right? So, when we talk about class, we're not talking about who's the enemy and who's not, in the sense that who's going to participate. It's more so of who's supposed to lead. But the primary contradiction of capitalism is the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. The other ones are sort of secondary. The small bourgeoisie against the big bourgeoisie is not as severe as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But again, the leadership of revolution falls to the proletariat, but it is the proletariat's task to actually unify classes and to gain support of other classes. But that's kind of more of a organization issue. I don't want to get into that. We're trying to stay on political economy here. Okay, we're going to move on. All right. Finally, in the same measure in which the capitalists are compelled by the movement described above to exploit the already existent gigantic means of production on an ever-increasing scale, and for this purpose to set in motion all the mainsprings of credit, in the same measure do they increase the industrial earthquakes, in the midst of which the commercial world can preserve itself only by sacrificing a portion of its wealth, its products, and even its forces of production to the gods of the lower world. In short, the crises increase. They become more frequent and more violent, if for no other reason than for this alone. And in the same measure in which the mass of products grows, and therefore the needs for extensive markets, in the same measure does the world market shrink ever more, and ever fewer markets remain to be exploited, since every previous crisis has subjected to the commerce of the world a hitherto unconquered or but superficially exploited market. But capital not only lives upon labor. Like a master, at once distinguished and barbarous, it drags with it into its grave the corpses of its slaves, whole hecatombs of workers who perish in the crises. We thus see that if capital grows rapidly, competition among the workers grows with even greater rapidity, i.e., the means of employment and subsistence for the working class decrease in proportion even more rapidly. But this notwithstanding, the rapid growth of capital is the most favorable condition for wage labor. Okay, that is the end. So, wage labor and capital, we got to understand that the main point that Marx is making is that they're in a dialectical relationship where, as productive capital increases, the reliance of wage labor on it grows. And we see how wages are determined. in the very early parts of this, right? And this is he kind of establishes this relation between capital and wage labor. And now we have this connection sort of drawn for us. Okay. In terms of a discussion, we can start off with any questions. Reread theory to get good quotes. I mean, reread theory in general, to be honest. It's good because a lot of times the first time we're gonna miss some things the first time. It's just feeling, could we do this?
You don't become an
Round
expert on
two.
something by only reading it once.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, all these texts. I mean, this is kind of like an initial breakdown. They're all gonna come into play. In terms of doing them again, I wouldn't mind. I would actually think it'd be interesting if we had like discussions of the texts we've already gone over. I'm trying to remember what texts we've gone over. We've done foundations, imperialism, on contradiction, and I think this. And then we read on authority, which is hella short. It's not even worth really talking about. But and then
We've read Alexandra Kollontai.
Yes.
We've read
You're reading Black Bolshevik now, right?
Yes, we are in the middle of Black Bolshevik,
Yeah.
which is going to start back up on Saturday. We also have read Catalina Adrian Zen's Marxism, Meritagi, and The Woman Question. We've read quite a bit here.
Yeah.
The read
Yeah,
army
that's-
reads. Whoa.
Exactly. There you go. And actually, I think it would be cool. I think if we had sort of discussions. So yeah, that'd be an interesting thing. But yeah, I don't know if you're on. I don't know if the names here don't all match like a Twitter handle or something. But I also, any of us really, if you want to DM with theory questions, that's also something we definitely do.
Yeah, you can DM the Red Army or just one of us if you have a question.
Yeah. I missed a lot.
Meritagi.
Yeah.
Caboose, it's very short. I don't know if it's like a book, but here it is, right here.
But yeah, I mean, for me, I think a good order of things is you kind of want to read philosophical, we'll say, theory, like talking about dialectical materialism, kind of in tandem. Political.
Oh shoot, we're getting a huge raid. Ben, thank you so much for the raid. Oh my goodness, we are at the tail end of our presentation on what were we talking about?
Wage labor and capital.
Yes. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. I saw that you were streaming today. Welcome in. We're at the questions section.
Yeah. If anyone have questions about wage labor and or capital, or both.
Everyone ask a question about wage labor and capital by Marx right now.
Now's the time. See if I can answer. It's very interesting to think about. I think one of the most interesting points from that entire thing was that whole you can't automate labor in its entirety. It doesn't work. It's antithetical to capitalism because
then there's nobody to buy their shit. Like,
exactly.
Who are they going to sell it to? You know, they would completely just fuck up their whole world order.
Yeah. We have a question. What do you think of capitalist realism and the psychological blinders its induction to cultural phase? Capitalist realism. I'm not sure I understand quite what that means. Capitalist realism. Is that like... Hang on. Can you explain? I don't know if you can explain what you mean. I'm like trying to... I've never actually observed capitalist realism or thought about it.
Gamer girl stream. It was a gamer girl stream. Oh, also I saw that you're using she, her pronouns right now, Ben. Is that true? Congratulations on that choice. if that is true. I just want to be sure if it is. I'm not sure, but yay, if it is.
What was the part where I said you can't increase profit? Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. It's basically like because so profit and wage or capital in this case, capital and wage labor because they're in a dialectic. When you affect one, it affects the other, but there are social sort of laws at play where you can't forcefully, like in a sense, like just bring about new productive forces, for example, or do this because there are other capitalists in the equation. So a lot of times, because there's this competition among within buyers, over the aggregate, it lowers the price of commodities essentially to their cost of production. You have periods where it's above, periods where it's below, and all those things that I mentioned. Like if a industry is not doing well, like the products are extremely expensive and no one's buying them, capital will be invested heavily into it to lower its cost. So over the period, it brings it back down to the cost of production. So it generally tries to even itself out, no matter what the individual manufacturer can really do. Okay, capitalist realism is the thought of capitalism being the only economic system that should exist. Oh, that's a very idealistic argument, I would say. I mean, it basically idealism kind of says that nothing really changes, right? So the argument is that this is like the end point of history. Like we've been searching for this system for however many years, and we finally found it, and now we're static. And the reason, and again, that's idealistic because again, idealism
It's so
kind of treats everything
weird
as
too.
it's a strange argument for sure. It treats everything as static and unchanging, which objectively, it's not even how the natural world works. You know,
Right? Like everything is constantly
nothing
moving.
works like
Like
that.
we talked about that.
Right.
That's
We're not
that's
immortal.
dialectical.
Nothing is immortal. Everything goes through its period of life and then it dies, and a new thing is born and it dies, and it's like this. It's this process, right? Of anyways, but yeah, capitalist realism. Oh wait, hold on. I gotta jump
Oh, we
up.
got big old
Kind of shorthand for the idea there. Oh, it's easier to imagine the end of the world in capitalism. Yeah, no, they do that. I mean, that entire, what's the quote? What was her name? Ursula, I can't remember. It was the divine right of kings. Like no one really saw that coming to an end. I don't remember the quote. I'm pretty sure most of you know what I'm talking about. But it's like this idea that they need you to think that nothing can change because it gives them that consent to continue. And there was this argument. What was it? This idea that in terms of colonialism, for example, in the age of colonialism, I'm going to draw a parallel here. A lot of how colonialism works is the show of force, or not the show of force, the sort of facade of force without actually using physical force. So officers in uniform is something that they bring up of how just having someone in uniform, for example, intimidates people enough to realize there's a social order that they are stuck under and they have no escape from. But
Well, that reminds me of Ugopnik's video.
yeah, I've actually never seen the videos. I mean, like, I should, to be honest. We're in the group chat.
Yeah, they're
Anyways,
really good. You should watch it.
yeah, there's a plug for you, Gopnik. I don't know. I should put that in the chat at some point. No, from what I know, he's pretty good.
Yeah, he is.
But yes, they want to entrench this idea of destitution and hopelessness. And actually,
Well, also,
see if
like
I can find it as we go along.
I was reading The Prince by Machiavelli today, and he was saying like, oh, the people don't know what to do without a king. You know, like the capitalists probably honestly think that like they need this. You know, we're making the world better for them. Like the people in charge think that they're like benevolent. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And they I don't know, the people in charge always think that. Just
Exactly.
musings of the prince today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A large part of power is hegemony. It's what we're conditioned to believe, essentially. And so a large part of that is the image of rule. So essentially, what happens is, like I mentioned earlier, they're not the physical force, but just the flexing of power in itself is forceful, even though it's not actually physically forceful. So you know, the police. You know, we see the police ever militarized. For example, their uniforms are starting to resemble like close to just military gear, and a lot of that becomes a sort of psychological entrenchment in our minds that we are trapped and there's no escape from it. But and here's where I guess you could say a lot of military theory comes in of how an organization springs up and how it gains support of the masses is through breaking this facade. And this is one of those things where people are stuck mentally in this image of I am under the rule of someone, right? Even though you may not see it physically, right? We don't inherently until now recently we're in the past let's say 5 to 10 years we're seeing more force break out, but over the periods of like decades they do their best to cover this up, any force that comes out, but we see it inevitably, especially in the age of the internet and whatnot. But again, they keep that image of actual force, they try their best to keep it below, and they keep it to this sort of flex of power to where you now know I'm under the control of someone else. I don't inherently experience it, but I know it. It's this entrenchment in our minds. And so again, a lot of the way we gain support of the masses is by breaking this facade, this hegemonic understanding of power relations. And yeah, so and again, they all tie into each other, right? There's like there's like four. There's like the political, economic, ideological, and military struggles or theories, I guess you would say. And you have to find a balance depending on your conditions. And that's for a different stream. But thinking about that, this is why you really need to go over all kinds of theory. You can't just focus on ideological theory necessarily, right? Where you just study, for example, dialectical materialism. We have to understand how to apply it. So we need to read examples of military theory, how it's applied in urban and countryside guerrilla warfare, for example. Political theory. We read about how organizations gain support of the masses, sympathy of the masses, right? And we read Lenin for this reason. We read his denouncement of economism, why we can't have economism, and we must also read political economy. This is why we reviewed this today. Political economy, although we don't think about it on a daily basis, it governs our lives. So to better understand this major contradiction in our society, or to destroy it, we have to understand it. And so this is a main focus. And so I do hope that you give it a read. I'm at some point going to do value, price, and profit as well. That one's a bit longer, but again, by like 10 to 15 pages, it's really nothing. Yeah. So, I mean, then again, this is interesting stuff. You should definitely go over it. I'm still reading Capital. It's kind of like my go-to text if I have nothing to read. I'm constantly switching between stuff. But again,
Yeah, I'm
political
actually
economy is
spite reading Machiavelli right now, so
yeah. I keep
it's
I don't
actually
know, like,
really
thought about it.
good, and
Yeah.
he's right about a lot. I feel like he's very intuitive. That
Yeah.
Machiavelli.
Uh, yeah. No, I mean, I know a lot of where the theories Marx and Marx and Engels come from are from people like not just Hegel but Feuerbach. I've never read Feuerbach, but now I'm thinking I should. I keep reading it. Oh, they got this
The answer.
scientist, an engineer.
Okay, there we go.
That's the shit. But yeah, I mean, again, if there's any other questions, I think now's the time.
Any other
What scared?
questions? Yeah, that scared me too. The anthem just like went off like super fucking loud in all of our ears.
Also, actually, I think now's a good time to cover it. I'm gonna do a shameless plug here, not
Okay,
for me,
do
for
it.
someone else.
Go off.
Hell yeah. So I mentioned earlier how it's important not just study ideological and political theory or economic theory, but also military theory and how these things come together.
But they say
So I'm
I'm
just
a
gonna plug this. I don't
tanky,
know.
oh,
I
I'm
think
a tanky, yeah,
this
I'm
is
a
the right way, isn't it?
tanky,
Yeah, this is
yeah,
the
I'm a
right way. So this
tanky.
is.
We're
I don't know if you
riding
can see
that
that.
tank, mowing down the fucking
This is a book
snowflakes.
from Foreign Languages Press. Can you read that? Yeah. Okay.
Fidai guerrillas
This is
speak on armed
yes,
struggle in Iran.
The Fidai guerrillas
Oh,
speak
Fidai.
on armed struggle in Iran. Fidai guerrillas are an organization. I would describe them as Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. Particularly, they're pretty staunchly anti-revisionist in this book, but they have a lot of military theory. They talk about how they gain support of the masses, how they engage in armed struggle, which leads to what, right? Do you gain sympathy of the masses and then engage in armed struggle, or do you begin armed struggle and through that process gain the sympathy of the masses, right? Yeah, military theory is pretty fun. I'm not gonna lie to you. Um, I will actually put a disclaimer here. If you're going to read military theory, I think it's important to distinguish or to understand where Che's theory of guerrilla warfare falls short. Actually, falls short a lot, to be honest, which kind of hurts because like Che was one of the first guys I admired, and I kind of started looking at his military theory. I'm like, this kind of fell short in a lot of places. The main one being his theory of guerrilla warfare, FOCO, as it's known, FOCO. And it fell short because he kind of ignored this aspect of political consciousness in the party. He essentially kind of placed a lot of emphasis on the actual guns or the firepower in his theory. Essentially, like how do you organize around firepower, but not organize the people first and then answer the question of firepower through the mass support. So that's something that I would say. But military theory is fun. I will definitely say it's interesting to see how 10 guys, for example, start somewhere and then build up from it, because
That reminds
it's pretty
me. Another
wild.
book we read was Carlos Marighell's Mini Manual for the Urban Guerrilla.
Yeah.
So that was
I
pretty
think
fun.
they have that on Foreign Languages Press, don't they? I gotta get that. I gotta get that.
Where do I have it on?
Actually, one of the other things I was gonna read right after this, I have it right below. I just have all these ready. This is the urban perspective from the CPI, the Maoist one, not the Marxist one.
I love that we both have just our stacks of books.
It's great, and like, but so, but yeah, it's good to study. It's good to study military theory. I enjoy it. It's pretty cool, to be honest. It's great.
So much
Yes, so much unread literature.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of scary. It is scary. I have so much. I keep getting recommendations every day. It's like it's never ending.
Yes, you should always critique your heroes. You should
Yes.
you should criticize like
Absolutely.
anything that needs criticizing. Criticizing things is not bad, right? If it comes from a good faith position, that it's should be welcome, and we welcome it.
Yeah. I think a big part of like the critique thing is people kind of like in the case like when I criticize Che, for example, and his theory of guerrilla warfare. The question is sort of like what should he have known that this is a bad strategy, right? It's not necessarily that people are just kind of doing this to force into existence something that will not come into existence, right? It's more of like did they know that this would work? And if not, time to move past it and fix it.
Right.
And that's the very basis of Marxism.
Right.
It's the very basis of science,
Of
really.
course.
People, I mean,
You try something. If it doesn't work, you alter it. You try again. Like, yeah, that's life.
yeah, I mean, it's the whole basis of science. I mean, there were previous theories where of scientific theories that are proven wrong, for example, right? The theory of like, I don't know what the atom looks like, right? There was like that one, what was it, like the plum pudding model, which just says it's just kind of like a blob. And that was later refuted by further research. But we don't say, haha, they should have known it looked like that.
He already
They had no way of
did.
knowing. I forgot what his name was. Dalton, I think, whatever it was. He applied this study that he had available at the time. This is like, I don't know, 1700s. How are you supposed to be able to observe this, right? You apply it, you see if it holds up. If it holds up, good for you. You got it right. If it doesn't, someone else has to correct it. And I say someone else because a lot of times it's like you have to wait generations for improvements in sciences. And this is also something really interesting of like how Marxism and the whole concept of the theories of dialectics, like the dialectics of the Greeks, for example, were so limited. Why were they limited? Was it because the Greeks were stupid? No. It was because their scientific and their discoveries at the time, their natural discoveries, were so limited, right? And so dialectics, because it's so inherently scientific, it is scientific. If how we learn things is so limited in terms of our scientific like instruments, for example, we have no way of developing even a social theory, right? That is as coherent, precisely because our observational tactics are very limited in the scientific world. And so that's why the dialectics of who was it? Heraclitus were very primitive. But again, we don't blame them for being primitive. We say they had no
Ooh,
way.
Heraclitus was
actually,
a trickster. I know that about him.
yeah, we don't say like, ah, what a dumbass. He didn't know what he was talking about. No,
He was a riddle
we
man.
say, yeah. No, we just say, okay, he had no way of knowing, right?
Right.
This is what they had at their disposal. We are products of our material realities. We are not going to jump ahead of our society, right? We're not going to think, oh, we should make this and then drive history forward. History makes people. People don't make history.
Okay, so one of the science facts is named Joe, and the other one is named Karl. Okay.
Wait, name two science facts.
I named them.
Name two science
You're
facts. The hell does that mean?
I gave them names.
Oh, okay.
That's why Marx wrote about. Don't worry, it was just a choice and I joke. Just me and
Okay.
choice.
Yeah, I don't get it. I'll
He
just
only
sit
knew
here.
about Germany and Europe. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
no, exactly.
he said
Yeah.
that like Russia was going to be the last place to have a revolution, and that the United States was, right. So, or I
Yeah,
know he said Russia was.
exactly.
And whoops, sometimes we just get you
Yeah.
wrong.
Absolutely. You have no way of knowing it until we do it. We validate our theory through our practice, and we validate our practice through our theory. They go hand in hand. That's their dialectical relationship. Engels wrote about no marriage, all orgies. Yeah.
Caboose.
Sure.
Don't read Caboose anymore. He's gone downhill. After it gets
Oh,
to
man.
orgies, there's not going to be anything good said from Caboose. Marx and Engels are boyfriends
man.
in my mind. Oh my god, the intro Chun-Li, they are like holding hands at one point, and it is so fucking cute. The anime.
It's bromance if you've ever seen it.
It was.
Exactly. And I mean, like, Engels was, I think, the perfect embodiment of a class trader, and it's something that, anyone of a sort of a class that's antithetical to the proletariat should strive for.
Right.
Just because you are inherently born into this, we're not going to jump to this. Oh, you're done, because one of the most important theorists of our time came from this class because he betrayed those interests. Yeah.
Yes, if there is any
So-
bourgeoisie in the audience, we will accept your money to fund the revolution. FYI.
Yeah. Sure. And if your dad is trying to get you to work in his company, you can always just deny and send the money straight to us so that we can start the revolution.
Peace.
I'm just kidding. Definitely don't do that. But yeah. Jesus was the ultimate class trader.
Wait, what?
Okay, I'm not an expert on theology, but I thought he was like born into like a
Sebs,
poor family.
are you doing a little joke? Because
I can't tell. uh, I don't know. I feel like if you were born into money, you wouldn't have been born in a state. Okay, all right. I'm
yeah,
still thinking it.
they were doing a joke.
Hey, man, that's one of the hallmarks of being inside and reading is I just jokes go over your head. Jesus was born to love. Yeah. I mean,
All that
yeah, he had to
frankincense
get out
and
of.
myrrh, true.
Let's be real. He had a get out of death free card. Not many of us get those.
Oh.
That's a privilege if I've ever heard of it. How many baby? Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
No one. Bro, I got one shot at this. You're right.
Okay, who
It is
is
98.
on?
Jesus was 1984. Jesus is Big Brother, actually.
Jesus is no iPhone Vuvuzela.
So are you a Marxist?
Vuvuzela.
Yeah, I'm currently in the process of becoming a Maoist. It's a long process.
Sorry, that was
Yes.
my Vuvuzela.
Oh my god, yeah, who was
Hell yeah, I do. Okay, so non-compete is on, and not that many other people.
Oh boy.
I'll just pick one.
Oh boy. Buckle up, I sense a bad take or something.
Oh, from they're nice. Okay, there's nobody else online.
Okay, hold on. Let's go this way. That's it. Okay, yeah, I was right. It's bad. Do I have any idea what it takes to run Walmart? Do you think Walmart would run without the workers actually selling
Oh my
their
god,
product?
are you
Hold on, I have
serious or are you kidding? Because I will just ban you because I don't have time for Walmart apologia.
Hold on. The CEO of Walmart does not have to deal with thousands of producers. Like they have a board of directors. This is specifically how it's set up. They own the means of production. They do that, and through that process, they are able to accumulate capital. They beat everyone across the board. How do they do that? Expropriation of labor. The
Entrepreneur.
workers are.
Dismissive wanking gesture. Okay?
Hang on a second. I want to read this.
Okay.
I'm going to slow down the chat so I can read this and just lose brain cells. You don't have to pay attention. Did you really just say the workers should start their own Walmart? Did you not hear? Oh, you must have missed the presentation. Are we going to have to
Why would
rewind
they
and
start
start this
Ford
over
Motor
again?
Company? Like no.
Has ever done that?
Sorry, go. You say something.
Yeah, he didn't listen to our presentation. Labor doesn't quit because the relation between wage labor and capital is dialectical. The wage labor has no choice but to sell their labor to survive. So long as they do this, they accumulate further capital for the capitalist. As long as capital is accumulating for the capitalist, the more dependent on it wage labor becomes. It has no choice but to continue selling its commodity of labor power to the capitalist to survive. Capitalist does not supply one thing of capital to the labor. The capitalist is the source of the wage for the labor to actually survive. Supply the idea for business. Do you even understand how generational wealth works? Take all the risk. Yes, you're right. Only the CEO takes the risk. I don't know why I'm wasting my time with this. This is like basic shit.
For real. Okay, we are.
Is it
I'm gonna
copy
tell
pasta?
you.
I can't tell anymore.
Oh, sorry. I'm gonna tell the schedule right now.
Okay. I'll
Friday,
stop. I don't even know what this
we
is.
have the
Yeah.
weekly news update. On Saturday, we have reading. We are reading Black Bolshevik again. And then Sunday we have our Discord watch party, and then Monday we have Revolutionary Kicks with Hayes. So yeah, we will see you back on Friday.
All right.
We are going to raid into Non-Compete, who is a very nice person. Yeah. Hold on, Kooks. I'm going to share the screen with you because this is our outro. So, for today, thank you all for being here. It was lovely spending time with you. Get some sleep. Enjoy your holiday if you celebrate it. But don't celebrate, obviously, the colonizers.
Yeah.
Think about
Celebrate with your
Indigenous
friends.
people. Yeah.
Do it for that.
Yeah.
Don't do it for.
Okay, love you. Bye.
Thanks.